Well,
Are we live?
yeah, we are. I mean, I don't know if there's anybody here yet because, we just went live, but we're
Right.
live. And so,
I was
oh,
listening to you and Glenn a few hours ago.
he's the living embodiment. Like if a smile had legs,
Yeah.
if the idea of a smile was given form,
Yeah. I tell you more. When we have a cloud meeting, like on Thursday, we have a cloud huddle,
Uh-huh.
and so Glenn joins as everybody else. And usually within 5 minutes, if Glenn didn't say anything, I'm like, well, something's wrong
Right.
because it's like this room is just
It's
not
broken.
the same until he just pulls his quirky, dorky joke
I
about
love
something. And of course, his T-shirts, they're classics. I mean, it's a basically like he's the only person in the world who you can say, "Oh, get some reading material," which is Glenn's T-shirts. That's the reading
right, right.
material.
Yeah, he doesn't just bring his A game; he brings his A
Yeah.
tech. Yeah, I love Glenn.
Right.
And we all, everybody on the spring team is amazing in their own special way, but none of us are. I mean, I'm sort of quasi famous for my T-shirt, but I've only got one. Right, it's a spring T-shirt.
But that's
right
what
now.
makes you the opposite of Glenn. You're
Yeah.
famous for a single T-shirt. You and that T-shirt is. Unfortunately, I have a picture of you in Moscow in that T-shirt in Red Square.
That was a great moment. Hey, I'm gonna go get some water.
Yes, go ahead, Josh.
Woo. Oh, I just got what you. Okay, I just got what you were saying about the unfortunately. Oh, okay, yeah. Red Square, the place is beautiful. Obviously,
No, the country is beautiful. The government sucks.
Yeah, exactly. There you go. And that's true for a lot of places. You can love the vista, the view of the thing.
Right. Anywho, let's.
Yeah.
Stay positive.
I'm trying. You and I are going to do our best impressions of Glenn today. It's going to be awesome.
We won't be able to succeed, so I'm not even going to try.
Okay, my friend. So this is the second live stream where I'm crossing the streams. Right. I've got the podcast, and it's a thing you can do if you haven't got any value for your time. Actually, the podcasts are fine. They're not terrible. People are fine. It's. The worst part is me, and you can't really get rid of me, so you're just kind of stuck with it. But the best part, knowing what a deficit you face when you come into these podcasts with me, I always arrange for somebody amazing to be on the show. So that's why today we're rejoined by my buddy Oleg. Yeah, I'm just glad you're here, buddy. This is so we're gonna put this one on the YouTube as well. We're live. This is not a normal thing.
Thank you, Josh. I have a question for you right off the bat. How long do you know each
other? 13 years, more like since 2010, right? Yeah.
It just we go way back.
And we've lost hair and gained weight in those years, and it's just been you could measure us, and I think we're there's if we had an hourglass full of lost hair and gained weight, it would just get worse and worse over the years. But we are wiser for our time together,
But I'm glad I had a chance to meet you, and I'm glad I had a chance to call you as a friend for this last 13 years. Even when I left the company for a little while, we still maintained contact. So
yep, it was a lot of fun. It was it's one of those things where you just know there's people out there that are doing amazing things. You just got to keep in touch, I don't.
And that's, as you said earlier, that's the entire spring team. I mean, there is a reason why there's only about 40, 50 engineers. So I hope not developing any inside information, but the amount of stuff that little group produces.
Oh my! I mean, it's not inside. Go to spring.io/team, whatever that number is. That's what we consider the spring team, and it's a rarefied group, and people don't leave, right? Almost never, and when they do, like with you for just a minute. And you came back, right? There's a reason. It's just such privileged
It's
rare.
like I went and wandered around, and I'm like, what the hell am I doing? I had it so good, and
Working on things that change the world. My friend, yeah. So we've had you on the show before, but can you just introduce yourself ever so briefly so that I don't butcher it?
Sure.
In whatever terms you want to do it.
Oleg Zhurakousky. I consider myself one of the original Spring Sourcians. I'm proud to always say that I'm the 99th employee, because back then we had like a very small Atlassian wiki, and since my last name is Zhurakowsky, it starts with a Z. It was always last, no matter how many people were hired after me, before me, or whatever. I would just push down the stack. So, and I remember clearly when I got access to the Spring Source at the time, Atlassian facilities. I'm like 99, so I'm still made it within 100. That was back in 2008. A lot of things happened back then. We obviously at that time, everybody did everything: engineering, mopping floors, making burgers, writing some code. Yeah, there was really not great distinction. But eventually,
Wear whatever hat you need to.
Huh?
Wear whatever hat you need to and more, right?
Yeah. And then most of us, a lot of us actually did a lot of training and consulting. So that was fun. And then as things started to streamline, I started doing more and more engineering, and eventually transferred to the full-time engineering with then Spring Integration, working with an amazing friend of ours, Mark Fisher.
Yep.
And
to this day.
Yep. And then I decided, you know what, this great technology, Hadoop, is going to take over the world.
Well, it did for a minute.
So I decided to say, listen, I'm going to stay on the cutting edge. Well, that was a bit of a mistake. Thankfully, I realized that mistake just in time to rejoin Josh and the team.
Yeah.
And right now, I'm a project lead, tech lead for Spring Cloud Function and Spring Cloud Stream projects of a Spring Cloud portfolio. Nice. Working with many amazing people, but most importantly, like the one relationship that I really cherish is to Dave Sire. Like I speak with him maybe 5-6 times a year.
Yeah.
But when I do, it's like deep, and then it just disappears. And then something and then disappears, but something typically comes out of it. So
yeah, we all have these. It's these wonderful
moments.
Yeah, well, it's these wonderful like interactions that I learn from everybody on the team, and you and I try not to bother you because I know you actually have a real job and all that, but every time we talk, I have fun and I learn something, which is why I'm glad you're here. You mentioned Fisher.
Yeah,
Fisher is one of the big cheeses now. One of the biggest of the cheeses on our team.
Yep.
Doing big amazing things, but he's not perfect. He's not infallible. He is the idiot that hired me, right? So we all make mistakes. I'll make mistakes.
And me.
Yeah, and you. Yeah, exactly. Like this. Like just a reminder. If you think you feel bad.
But speaking of big cheeses, Mark.
Yeah.
Being a big cheese, still reaches out. Like, in fact, when we were in San Francisco, he reached out.
Yeah.
Because not just to say hi, but on the technical side, like he still reaches out to us to consult with us, to get some help, to exchange ideas and so on. So he's still very much, in my opinion, part of the team.
Of course, that's what I'm saying. He's one of our big cheese. Like, if we are a stack of cheese, he's on the top with one of the smelliest, delicious odors. It's like blue cheese or something. I don't know. I love him. He was, so the reason you and I both know him is because you worked on a project called Spring Integration, and I was external at the time, and I was contributing bugs in record speed.
You made our life difficult.
What?
Difficult.
Yeah.
Because every time I would wake up, there was like a bunch of issues open from Josh, who doesn't really know how to use Spring Integration, so he just he really knew how to use Jira.
Yeah. I was very good at Jira. Very good. Yeah. And then I would send buggy. So people don't remember, there's a time before GitHub. And hey, us here. Good to see you, buddy. There was a time before GitHub, and so I would send patches. Right? Do you remember patches?
Yep. Subversion patches.
Subversion patches, and there was a time before that where we had CVS. Let's not even talk about that. We don't have to talk about it. It's fine. We're in a safe space here. But yeah, I would send patches full of just rife with bugs, just riddled with bugs, and it was almost like a New York Times crossword puzzle for you, Oleg, where I would just send you a challenging piece of code that was just more broken than not. And could you turn it into something good? And yeah, you could most of the time.
There is this silver lining there, because if it wasn't for you, like working in open source, one of the problems working in open source is that we're kind of already, we're open source remotely. We're kind of in the silos. We, imagine our own requirements. We do things, and then someone like you come in, who, right or wrong, I mean, you have a problem and you need more cowbell, and you want to provide it, right? So we needed to do something to address this issue or that issue, and eventually at the end that made the framework better, not necessarily by addressing the issue, but actually thinking about your issue. A lot of issues were not addressed. They were closed. It's just, you don't know what you're talking about, but they made us think.
Right.
They made us think about, like, why is he thinking? Why is he assuming that this is going to work this way? Because if you, a smart person, actually considering a smart person, think it's going to work this way, then maybe 1,000 of other people will think the same way. Then maybe we should address it either through documentation or make code more readable or something along those lines.
Something. It just worked out. I think it was just it's a wonderful synergy. So that moment in time was because I remember the original cast. There's Mark Fisher, of course. So Spring Integration was what, 2007, right? Like it's an old project.
Wouldn't call it old, but old.
In the scope of like software and the modern open source world, it's like half of the entire time of open source, right? When was the first big open source stuff happening? I guess the early 90s, right? Like
no, I would say, in terms of wide adoption, we're talking 2000. So even back then, we were still talking about, some people were questioning the open source model, if you remember. 2008,
yeah, of course.
2009, people were still not sure that open source is the way to go.
Well, do you remember the whole scandal around JBoss having? They wanted to get certified as an application server, but it was open source, and they couldn't get certification kits and all that stuff. Remember that whole big stink?
Yeah.
That was 5 years before all this. That was like 2003, I think, or something like that, right? It was huge, big thing. And then
I'm
there was
a proud JBoss certified consultant for certification.
Right. Yeah, it's awesome. It was, I loved JBoss. Was an amazing opportunity, but they gave away the code, but they charged for the documentation, right? That was the whole thing. And I'll never. And people, like, you say that to somebody today in 2023, it's like, what? Like, there's, it doesn't seem. But that's how we were all trying to figure out what open source looked like professionally, how you could make money on it and do it sustainably and still be open source. They did a great job. I mean, they delivered something that is enduring, and so it's hard to discount that,
It is.
But so you and I worked when you think about Spring Integration coming around in 2007. Well, if we're talking about like open source Java came out in 2000. When was Java open source? Was that after that? Like Java the language, right? Like that was after, I think.
After, yeah. It was definitely after.
Yeah, exactly. Like this is it's not 2007 is a huge amount of time. If we talk about like Linux came out in 1990, right? The first major open source thing that I think we can all point to. There's some stuff from GNU, right? But even if you just say like whatever, let's say 1990, what is that? 33 years. Right, and Spring Integration's been around for since 2007. That's 16 years. Right? That's a long time. Yeah, exactly. So it's an old project. It's just a very good project, and it changes with the times. And the reason is because we got people like yourself and me, and now Artem and Gary and Mark originally, and Ewain, right?
It was original team was Mark, Ewain, and Marius.
Marius Bogovici, who's now at our friend over.
Which is funny, since we brought Marius. When I came in, and if you remember, there was a bit of it was right before you joined. There was or maybe when you were already part of the Spring, they did a little house cleaning. It was pre-acquisition, and Marius left, and I took over his spot in engineering. So this was my time to move to engineering. Well, ironically, when I rejoined the spring team in 2017,
Oh,
here with Pivotal, Marius was leading Spring Cloud Stream, so he was back as well. And then he decided to go back to whatever he came from.
right.
I got a phone call from management if I would like to take the helm of Spring Cloud Stream. So I kind of like
You keep off
did a
moving.
leftovers for Marius twice. So, which was great.
Yeah.
But it was just like, to me, that those type of coincidences kind of like, I always start thinking like, wow, something's
Well,
weird.
it's a very small pool. Yeah. I didn't really. I mean, it makes sense you say that. I do remember all those dates. I just don't. Huh. Yeah. Okay.
Yep.
This is the other thing. You have stayed more or less on the messaging and integration side of the house. I know in the spring team, nobody says no to pull requests if they're good. It doesn't matter where you submit, right? Like if you tomorrow decided to get deep into the soap stack or whatever, or whatever, right? Like you could do whatever, but basically we all kind of like, there's certain bits of grass that we graze on, right? Where we're happiest. And you, because I think you like it, have just stayed on the messaging and integration and, if there's a broker in there, I think I can find your code somewhere around there,
Right. I think the big part of it was actually working on Spring integration because, first of all, working on the project itself and understanding the patterns, but also working with Mark, and then obviously being exposed to the rest of the team and to the Spring mentality of writing code, thinking about the code, thinking about architecture and so on. Basically, the clearest separation of concern, that you can possibly achieve if you wish. And to me, like I keep attributing this phrase to Rod Johnson. I don't know if it was actually him. So in case if he listens, don't. But
might be apocryphal, but
somebody said, like, let's just say Rod said that there's no such thing as a complex problem, that any complex problem is just an array of simple problems. And all you need to do is just break it into the simple problems and address them individually, and then just have a mechanism to reassemble it. And to me, like I said, I think he said it because I remember that moment, like eureka moment. Like I'm like, wow, it's almost like my life changed in a way where, like this is like, for example, now going back to Spring Cloud Function, like write something like right now I say there's no requirement past, present, or future that you cannot map to functions applied or consumer, right? So very simple interface given to you by Java, not even Spring, so nothing to do with Spring. You write your requirement using function, using any framework that you want.
Yeah.
Simplest possible way. We provide a way to say, listen, if you stay compliant with this interface, I know how to turn this invocation into as a message handler or a REST endpoint or AWS Lambda or Azure function or whatever. So you never have to change the code. In fact, I always say, if you look at Spring Cloud Function application, you don't even know it's a Spring Cloud Function application. The only thing you see on the screen on the code is that it is a Spring Boot app with a function bean in it or function beans in it. That is all, right? And until you look at the POM, you have no idea what it does or how it's going to be executed. And that goes back to this whole problem of address something simple and then move on to another problem. So first, find a way to encapsulate your business logic. Then find a way to turn this into a message handler or a REST endpoint or something else, and so on and so forth. Yeah.
I love it. I mean, so is this an example of? I think about Spring integration a lot, right? Obviously, Spring integration. You have channels. You have these components that sit at the end of them. And the
consumer was never knew about one another.
You already had kind of a functional pipeline, right?
Of course, definitely.
And then at some point, I think it became very useful to just do a chained pipeline, right? Like in Spring integration, you can have a chain.
Because you said this is exactly the point. Address some of the simple problems, but if you want to skip the channel and message regeneration, because this chain represents a flow that is relatively static, put it in the chain. Yeah. It's going to be all by reference, no more like message passing, but the way you wrote it, it is message passing. It is immutable. It is everything else, but you just assembled it into, it's And right now, the equivalent of that, guess what? Function composition.
Yeah, exactly.
So, yeah. So now we can say, listen, I don't want to write a big complex function. I want to break down. So I want to do this, then I want to do this, then I want to do this, then I want to do this. I want to draw it on the paper, and I say, okay, I'm going to implement A, B, C, and D. And then I'm just going to say function A, and then function B, and then function C. And of course, a sprinkler function, we provide a simpler mechanism to do that, but the result is the same. The result is you have a single function that does all this great stuff, is extremely complex, but it only complex is during the assembly. You never see the complexity.
And the assembly these days, it used to be you would have a @enable binding, and you'd get a channel, and you'd write code in terms of that channel. Now it's just literally you just write properties. It's just Spring Boot properties that describe the binders and the flow, the message composition, right?
As you probably know, I am not a huge fan of annotation. Never have been.
Yeah.
Especially for the runtime. For annotating something that is deprecated or whatever, that's fine. Yeah. But for the runtime, the reason being is that, especially again after Spring integration or during Spring integration, we were so, again, separation of concerns. I was so happy to, project from the stage during conferences, including with you several times, that here's separation of concerns, here's the code, here's the configuration. That goes back to XML days, which for Spring integration I actually loved.
Yeah, it made it very explicit.
The point is that, like in Spring Cloud Stream, when I took over from Marius, we have Stream Listener, we have all this send to, receive. I'm like, man, this is not really good, because you wrote really streaming application, and anything you want to do, and also the channel, like as much as I love channels, you know that.
Right.
This was the higher level abstraction, so why is it still channel aware?
Right.
It shouldn't be. That's internal implementation. So this is where, kind of Spring Cloud Function came in. This is where Dave Sayer decided to do what Dave Sayer does, just ship off another project to somebody else. I ended up to be the lucky one, and I got Spring Cloud Function from him, and I'm like, wait a second, now that makes sense. If I use Spring Cloud Function as a programming model, then everything becomes just a configuration. So a little bit of a convention, embrace Spring Boot, and bam, we got a Spring Boot app, some dependency in the POM file, all of a sudden you have a function that is a rest endpoint. Done.
Right.
And you have not a single configuration.
No configuration. It's because Spring Boot is pretty great at giving the framework developer cues without even requiring annotations a lot of times. You can just define a bean of understood type. And
I actually had this discussion, like this whole concept of, remember how Spring Boot, early Spring Boot, I mean, some framework still uses that, enable this. I'm like, wait a second, you already put dependency on a class path.
Yeah.
You already express intention that you want to use it. Why are you enabling it? Right. So we had an enable function, something that I removed eventually. I just had to be very careful, because it was, the authors were both Fisher and Sayer, but there was some kind of enable, I forget already, in Spring Cloud Function. So I removed it. I'm like, no, you already express intention. If anything, like disable, that would make more sense.
Right. Opt out, not opt in. Right.
Yeah.
And we just had this whole thing with enable batch processing, right? They flipped it, so you have to opt in. Like if you want to override default behavior, then you say enable batch processing. But the problem is we had that there for so long that now, the default behavior used to be you have to have enable batch processing, otherwise the Spring Boot starter didn't work. So it's the only thing I can think of where you have to opt in both in the dependency and the annotation. Now in 3.0, Spring Boot 3 and batch 5, they just flipped it. So now if you have that, you're disabling the default starter, but it means that everything you did before broke. So but that's the pain you just described, moving people away.
At least with Spring Cloud Function being a relatively new project, I didn't have to deal with the pain of backwards compatibility, because at the time when I removed it, we didn't have a huge user base.
Right. Yeah, which is good. Yeah, exactly. But it's so painful. But it's actually better for everybody to move away from this stuff, to undo this extra ceremony. Because you're right, Spring Boot, your intent is clear. I added the starter for Spring Cloud Function. I want that. If I didn't, I wouldn't add it to my class path. Right. It's a big commitment to add something.
In fact, it also enforces, in my opinion, a clean programming, because how often we developers look at the POM file if everything works.
Right. Yeah. Right.
If it works, it's just there, right? Or great. So it's only when things break we're like, oh, so now I can have like 5-6 dependencies there that makes no sense to be there in the first place. And I've, back in the old Spring days, I've seen many POM files that has like, what is this doing there? Like, oh, we used it 3 years ago. I'm like, well,
get rid of it.
Yeah. So, and in fact, we were like,
That's a good point.
Like Spring Context version 2.0 and then Spring Core version 1. It was a lot of weird stuff that we saw.
That's why I love the starter and the dependency management, the starters. It seems so obvious now, but like to write code against any framework, Spring included, before Spring Boot was assembling your dependencies. Everybody had their own, like, I know these dependencies work well together. I've got a notepad text file somewhere that I copy and paste this from, and it's my blessed set of dependencies. And if anybody changes even one thing, the whole house of cards implodes, house of cards. Like, but now it's just like, well, just bring in a starter. That is my intention. It is my, it's amazing. It's amazing that that's dependency management mechanism. So, okay, let's talk about that though. So Spring Cloud Function, you got that from, I forgot about that. It was Dr. Sire's original rough, and then you polished it off to become a
many other things, like pretty much every other thing.
Well, a lot of things, yeah. He's another one of the big cheeses, obviously. So Spring Cloud Function, you have this nice functional component model. I don't think that, so what you did is the cleanest way to do it, but I don't think people are 100% on the same page yet. I think getting people to talk about function, how with Spring, we had to teach people about dependency injection in the very beginning. Like, it wasn't just, here's the application context, here's the bean factory. It was, here's dependency injection. You need to appreciate why that's useful before this makes sense. And so same thing right now. I think right now you and I and the gang are fighting an uphill battle, teaching people about how to think functionally, how to think about messaging and events, and
Right. And speaking of function, I mean, I had an interesting discussion with Mark when I rejoined Spring. When I actually took over Spring Cloud Function, was when I was still interacting with Mark sort of daily. Yeah. I said, you know what? Like, going back to Spring integration, I honestly wish Java developers, Java guys, thought of function supplier and consumer and basically Java utility function package right from the beginning. Because had they done that, so many APIs would have been much, much, much simpler. And because of that, so there are so many frameworks and integration frameworks would have been much more concise. Because, for example, the message handler, right? The one of the core interfaces of Spring Cloud, Spring integration, right? Yeah. Which is what? It's a consumer, right?
Yeah.
So it's a glorified consumer because it's a something that receives an input and produces no output, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so that's a consumer. Now, if message handler extends consumer, what does it mean? What does it mean to me? To me, it means that if I want to operate at the level of message handler from Spring integration, then I'm going to do all my casting and everything else at the level of message handler and say, if it's not an instance of message handler, I'm not going to deal with it. Right. But if I'm creating a framework that is ready to invoke anything that is a consumer, that is capable of dealing with anything that's consumer, then I'm going to lower my standards and say, listen, if you're a consumer, I'll deal with you. Same goes for functions, same goes for suppliers. So all of a sudden, it basically creates this vocabulary because not only it creates what I just said, it also says, okay, well, if I talk to you in terms of function, remember how like we embraced the enterprise integration patterns? Said it was a vocabulary because I don't have to explain you what the filter is. I assume you know what it is. So all I need to do is just, we're going to put a filter here, and you know exactly, or router, you know exactly what the outcome of that's going to be. The same thing here. Oh, Josh, I'm going to use a function, so you know it's going to be input and it's going to be produce something, or it's going to be a consumer, which means nothing's going to be produced, and so on.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. Does message handler, does that take a payload and the headers, or does it just take a message?
It takes a message. So within the core Spring integration, it takes a message. And when I say it doesn't produce anything, it's not necessarily true because
it's just a function. Then
it simply means that the function doesn't return anything to the caller, but it can still send the message internally, and that's exactly how integration works. So if you remember the abstract message handler, that would send the message to the next channel and so on.
Yeah. Okay, that's interesting. I wonder about that. Like, I wonder if we could. So that means
create a chain.
Yeah, but if we did that, that means that everything that is a message handler right now in Spring integration, which there's a ton of, right? There's probably hundreds of them, that would also be usable from Spring Cloud Function.
Well, thankfully it is because we support POJA functions. So in other words, the duck typing, it works in Spring Cloud Function. Nice. So if it walks, quacks, smells, and poops like a duck, it's probably a duck. Right?
Because it's got. Oh, right. Okay, so you're using a what do they used to call it? Single abstract method.
Yeah, functional interface. Like if it basically, if it's single public method, and it fits into the category of supplier function, consumer will support it. We support it. It's a but
cool.
I'm saying I had to do something for it, and
Right.
of course, a few hiccups possible here and there.
Right.
Had it been a function, supplier, or consumer, I wouldn't have to do anything.
Well, I mean, to be fair, Spring Integration predates Java 8 by like a decade, but yeah, like
right. And I'm saying that this is as a Java developer, this is one of my sort of regrets that I'm like, I wish they thought of that. That's one thing that everything else, generics and other things like, it's fine. They came in due time, but that should have been Java 2.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, if we could go back and rewrite the world. Do you remember? I actually had a Mario Fusco on the show over the holiday. I think like beginning of January or something like that. Right. He's a Italian Java champion, and he was working on Lambda, like Project Lambda, the original effort. This you might remember this. The effort to bring lambdas to the JVM was like a decade long.
Yeah. Okay, yeah.
And yes. We finally got it in Java 8, and it's fine. Like, whatever, it's fine. It works. Okay, nobody's gonna sit there and say it's the same as like in
Scala, or
or Scala, or whatever. By the way, we should talk about that too. Forgot about that. Spring Scala. Yeah, but nobody's gonna sit here and say it's the same as those. But it does work, and it does open up a world of new possibilities, amazing possibilities for the JVM developer. And I think now, that work, that decade of thoughtfulness and care, and it paid off. It paid dividends, right? These people that worked on it for so long to bring JVM lambdas to the JVM, that it has paid off. And now we have this whole ecosystem of opportunity, and I think one of the first things to take advantage of that was, of course, Spring Cloud Function, right? But I also think it kind of landed right at the same time as a discussion around serverless, right? Serverless. I don't remember when Lambda hit, but when did AWS Lambda come out or whatever? I'm going to Google it right now because
November. I'm using ChatGPT. I started using it this morning. It's such an amazing thing.
Oh, so good. It's dangerous though because you get that you have a brain. And I don't have much of one anyway, so I cannot afford to let it fall into disuse.
I actually did it. Who is and put my name in there, and it just gave me like the whole resume of myself. I'm like, oh my god.
Oh no. 2014. That's the same year as Java 8 came out.
Yeah.
Same year. So 2014 Lambda, and then it coincides with this. Hello, Simon. Hello. I forgot to. I don't know if I said hello to everybody who's joining the chat and whatever. Hello from all around the world. If you're joining us now, we've got Oleg you say it with a ZH, right? Zhurakousky?
Oleg Z, that's fine, yeah.
Zhurakousky. I've always called you just Zhurakousky because I'm an idiot. But apparently that's the wrong way to do it. So yeah, if you're joining us, you're joining Oleg today. He calls himself the function dude, which makes sense. He's the lead of Spring Cloud Function. Like
it's a pun on Jeremy Graley, if you remember.
WebDude, exactly. WebDude. Yeah. I remember he used to call himself the web dude, and that was
it was such a
class act. So you're that use case is everywhere now, serverless, right? And so serverless, I think, is another example of where the world needs to start thinking. It's not just Java, right? It's every other language. They just really haven't started to think about, if I have one function, if I want to compose the world, if I want to build the world one function at a time, what do I put there? And it's sort of like, well, you've got your solid for Java apps, your solid principles. What's the solid for functions, right? Like how that kind of overlaps. But when you start to build a function and you want to solve a problem and you're going to do it with Lambda, you say, okay, I've got this Lambda stack. I've got serverless. I've got a function as a service stack of some sort. What are the use cases that people should reach for or think about and reach for that technology in particular, and then not think about it? What are the good use cases and what are the bad ones?
Well, use cases are many. I mean, it's really more not about the use case per se. It's about the type of use case where you have a single task which kind of completes, like stateless, preferably, because
Right.
every time you have a state, you inviting tons of trouble. But so it's something that is that you know, like you just ask Siri, when is the and it completed, right? So done. So and if all of a sudden there's a menu request, I mean, you want to scale up, scale down. So these are the type of use cases that are good for this type of thing, because now you just think about what the proposition here is. You write a functional code, you write a function, you just package it and you just throw it out there on AWS or Azure or whatever. You don't have to think about the deployment platform. You don't have to think about any of the stuff that we had to think as Word developers or Java. No, none of that. Like all this configuration files, all this proper mappings and anything. None of that. You just throw it out there and it's there. And if nobody's using it, eventually it will die, right? But because you're not getting billed, nobody's charging any money for that, like no hosting company or anything like that. Then all of a sudden the request comes in, and the only problem you have to deal with at that point of time is hot and cold starts, right? So which is already being solved, and we can probably talk about this with both Spring Native and Snapstart, Project Crack, which is like, I always crack a smile when I hear that. I'm like, whoever come up with that acronym may not have speaking person.
For those of you joining the show right now, Oleg and I are 12. We're just 12. We haven't matured at all, and so that is a funny joke for us. The rest of you can feel free not to giggle if you don't want to. So yeah, but you're right. Project Crack is hot sauce. I love GraalVM. Obviously, I spend all my time talking about it. But if you really care about startup time, and there are very few use cases in which I think you should, like, it shouldn't be a paramount concern, except when you're doing like serverless is the obvious one true use case, but if you really care about startup time, maybe GraalVM isn't the best way forward. It's an amazing way forward, and we'll talk about that in a second.
And it's still no. So it is. I mean, there is plus and minuses of either approach, right? So your footprint is much smaller with the GraalVM, but I mean, getting to that point will require you to the compilation, build, and everything else, right? But
also
the startup much faster, guaranteed. But with Crack, it's almost. Did it ever shut down?
Crack is so fast it doesn't matter. Like, I saw a demo with a Spring Boot app, not Spring Cloud Function, like an actual honest to goodness Spring Boot app with some stuff on the class path. And Spring Cloud Function is Spring Boot, but I'm just saying you would be incentivized to pare it down there. Whereas a Spring Cloud with Spring Boot, you're just like, I can do whatever. I saw an app start up in not 20, not 200, 2 milliseconds on Crack.
Right.
On GraalVM, I'm lucky if I get
on
80.
Crack.
Yeah, on Crack. Yeah, no, Crack is amazing. Right? What is it? Coordinated checkpoint restore, right? Checkpoint, coordinated restore and checkpoint. No, coordinated Crack. I don't know, whatever. It's one of those things where it was originally proffered by Azul Systems, and it only works on Linux, and you have to do some goofy things with the Linux permissions and whatever. But if you do all those things in the right order and use the right magic incantation, you can get a JVM application that starts up in literally faster than the neurons in your brain will fire, right, to recognize the signal that something is happening, right?
And that's the important part. So basically, it's a coordinated restore at checkpoint.
Thank you.
Yeah. So, but basically that. So going back to your original question about the use cases. So you think about not necessarily, because when we talk about Spring Cloud Function, for example, when I do my examples, I really say, listen, I do uppercase or lowercase or some kind of a trivial code. I said, because I really don't care what's inside the function itself. Right. It's irrelevant. You have 1,000 lines of code or 1 line of code. It makes absolutely no difference to me. It's the signature important, what it looks like. So, but how do I want this function to live? Like, is it something that goes in and out?
Right.
This something and forget, right? Is it going to be used by a lot of people? There's going to be spikes. There's going to be this type of things. So all of a sudden, I'm like, well, this is the best. And do I really want to care about or worry about how I'm going to package it, deploy it, and everything else? If the answer to these questions, obviously, yes and no, then yeah, this is your perfect use case for Lambda-style architecture. And here's the interesting thing. I hope I'm not really jumping into this too early. What I have been talking to, I'm going to skip with the names, but some of our engineers that were basically saying, listen, what about, so Spring Cloud Function relatively new model. So, and again, we're talking about greenfield development. So you were talking about the adoption and everything else. So yeah, if you're writing something new, fine, go ahead, write a function. We'll do whatever we want with it. But we have tens of thousands of REST apps out there, controllers. I mean, you of all people know how many controllers are out there in the world.
Oh yeah, innumerable. Yeah.
So so the question was, can we deploy a controller as a Lambda? And because the proposition is the same, if I can do that, then at some point of time, if nobody's using it, that controller will die until somebody hits it again, and it will resurrect itself, right? So, and first of all, the answer is yes, it's doable. At the beginning, it didn't make much sense to me, like why and how. But then I'm like, wait a second. There is a what is a Lambda? Lambda is just a piece of code. If I can have access to the Spring Boot app that represents the RESTful application and invoke it within that function, then basically like typical function exposed via API gateway in AWS or HTTP trigger on Azure, right? I can effectively forward my request to that web app that I deployed as part of my function, right? And to do it not over the network, to do it by interacting with one of the historical components of Spring, dispatcher servlet, directly.
Right.
We already do it in a mock MVC. You of all people know that very well.
Right.
So yeah, there's interesting things happening on that front, and hopefully will be coming out publicly soon.
I would love to see it. So this is one of those. So
I can show it to you. I can show it to you like
after screen. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh wow. Is the idea that you have like multiple methods and you could deploy each one of them as a function, or?
I'll show you the pet store. Yeah.
Oh, so cool! Wow. To talk about reuse of value, now I can connect because again, REST.
Yeah,
is great.
That's exactly reuse of value. That's a good point.
Right. But REST is great, but you know what? Me, because I'm lazy, and also I have a little experience that I learned from people like you. I've learned that whenever I can, I'm going to put a broker in front of my endpoint. Right. If I can avoid REST and avoid having to, because I feel like all sophisticated REST APIs end up being at some point a half-built, lazily implemented version of a message queue. They have to be available. And why? Just skip that. Just go straight to the message queue. Add the messaging layer there. And when I say messaging, I'm talking about that substrate that allows you to take delivery of a message, make sure that it gets redelivered, all that kind of stuff. Whether that's Lambda or Azure Functions or Kafka or RabbitMQ, you know what I mean. That's
you're just giving me the idea because I'm doing this indirect receiving requests and forwarding it to another sort of endpoint.
Right.
I can now think about again, this is for listeners. This is how some of the ideas come out in Spring, just for conversations like this.
Right.
Unfortunately, it's spilled out in the public now. That if you put a broker in between, that just means that the application on the receiving end could actually be down for maintenance while I'm still receiving messages in. Yep. And I can distribute them later when the application goes back up, which is effectively Spring Cloud Stream model.
Yeah, exactly. That's amazing, right? Like that, and you get that if you can do that for me by just taking my controller and automatically making it a function.
Man, I can, like I said, I can literally, wow. I can do like you can like after this I can show it to you. I even have the whole deploy script.
Yeah. Sir, you're amazing. One of the things I asked you about recently, I know the problem I have, my friend, is that when I talk to you, I know that you're doing nice things for lots of other people. So I don't like to bother you too much because, life is short and you can only do so many miracles per day. But I asked you for, I was just wondering, because my brain, it's not so good.
Yeah.
So I asked you for some help the other week. Or a minute or a year or whatever, it's, I don't know, a minute, like a while ago. And I was looking for
weeks ago, yeah.
Yeah, GraalVM.
Yeah, I did it. Did I?
Yeah, I know. And it was awesome. And so
okay. I want people
to know about that. I'm gonna find it. But can you tell us, so you talked about, well, actually, before we go into that, can you tell people broadly, Spring Cloud Function, how does it work with something like Lambda? How do I develop it, right?
So again, develop it as a developer. Unfortunately, as a developer, you never see Spring Cloud Function. As a person who writes code, you never see Spring Cloud Function. Even if you writing a Spring Cloud function code. You never see Spring Cloud function because the frameworks with Spring Boot, our frameworks have changed,
right?
A lot, because they're really enablement frameworks, so to speak. So I'm going to basically put something in the class path, and that something is no longer just a jar file as a library. It's auto configuration that's going to do something and is going to expect something from me. And the expectation in Spring is always the same. I'm going to have certain beans out there that I'm going to be looking for. And if you provide me with those beans, I'll do whatever I need to do if you brought me in, right? If you brought somebody else, they will do whatever they want with those beans, right? So in other words, the same beans becoming either message handler or REST endpoint or Lambda or whatever. So to your question, you're right. Let's say your uppercase function, which is, very simple example that we always do. And what happens is you add a few dependencies on the class path.
Right.
One of them is Spring Cloud function adapter AWS. And then you just so there's about 5 or 6 samples for AWS, and you just add run a Maven clean install and you deploy it. And right now I'm gonna add the SAM script serverless application model, which is basically you can do it manually through the AWS dashboard, or you can do it by executing a script, which basically like SAM build, SAM deploy, guided, done. All of a sudden you have a function with an AWS API gateway and whatever. And identical thing is for Azure. In fact, my colleague and a friend and a person who helped me right now with Azure stuff, Christian Solov, just published a blog like literally a few hours ago. There's some cool stuff, some new cool stuff that him and Julian and the team at Microsoft came up with. And with Azure. So in other words, now, like we always were sort of like had a little sort of a friction, like I said, AWS programming model, because it's based on configuration, became cleaner than Azure. But now it's like, getting very interesting with Azure. So but basically, going back to the question, you just write a function and then you add dependencies and you package it and you deploy it.
And the packaging is, I think, actually, programming wise, it couldn't get simpler.
Because it's a plugin, so you still run. You say Maven clean install, Maven clean package. That's it. So you, like I said, it's like sometimes
it's the packaging that's hard.
Yeah. Well, it's creating the POM file, but you don't have to create it because we don't create stuff no more. We just copy stuff from
Stack Overflow
from other people who already went through the pain. I'm not going to repeat that, right?
Right.
So
or ChatGPT now, just
Yes. Oh, this morning I was messing around and I wrote a deliberately wrong code, like lowercase string that value of all lowercase, and I put 1, 2, 3. I said, "What is wrong with this code?" And it told me exactly what's wrong with that code, to the point of not putting a semicolon at the end.
Oh, it's ridiculous. It's like, son of
scary.
a gun.
Scary.
Yeah, and you can ask it to do like silly things, like you can say, "Okay, render a flower using d3.js," and it's like, it'll do it. It'll actually give you a script. It's crazy. The Turing test seems very quaint now, right? I think we should actually have a are you human test? That's a much more interesting one now, because we know the computers can pretend to be human, right? That's not even a question word. The question is, can the human be almost as smart as a computer still, right? I don't know. I'm starting to wonder. My friend. Okay, so we talked about. We've got people. The chat's popping off. We've got a lot of people talking about functions, and our friend Deshaun even said he's got an example showing how to do Spring Cloud function on Azure as well. There are some different runtimes, right? We talked about Lambda. That's, I think, the 800-pound gorilla these days. There's Azure functions. Google has one. I confess I've never used it. I'm sure it's fine. Is that supported with Spring Cloud function?
Yeah. So basically, with Google, we have a different arrangement. So the guys reached out to me. I don't write. Nobody. We distribute their code. It's part of our release schedule, but we don't, aside of some minor check style things or some minor polish and fixes and dependency upgrades. Google team contributes to Google function.
Right.
Module. So basically, we got community involved, but yeah.
That's amazing. What other supported? So I know you can use Spring Cloud function with Spring Cloud Stream, and Spring Cloud Stream gives you Google Cloud Pub
I
Sub. It
wouldn't
gives you
phrase it
Kafka.
like this. I would say that Spring Cloud Function is the programming model
Right.
for Spring Cloud Stream.
Right. But what I'm saying is that gives you a whole world of stuff right there. You get Kafka, Google Cloud Pub Sub, Azure Service Bus, RabbitMQ,
Solus,
Kinesis maybe, right?
Kinesis, Solus,
Pulsar.
Pulsar.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So that's
Sobi
already,
and Chris Bono, they're
yeah.
about to unveil the binder.
Nice.
Pulsar.
Okay. So we got all that stuff. That's just Spring Cloud Stream, and then Spring Cloud Function gives you even more opportunities. That gives you, like I said, AWS. It gives you Azure. It gives you Google. Anything else I'm missing? Like,
Yeah. So gRPC, RARSocket,
gRPC.
web. So it's just whatever people ask, we do, we deliver. Because if you think about it, in retrospect, if we were to go back, there would be one project called Spring Cloud Function, and binders would effectively be just adapters, like because that's exactly what it is. But because Spring Cloud Stream came before function, it would be right now quite an effort to restructure, refactor it in such a way. But from the architectural standpoint, Rabbit binder, Solus binder, AWS adapter, or Azure adapter are just adapters. They're all adapters.
Right.
And underlying programming model is function, and that's what Spring Cloud Function does.
It's amazing.
Allowing you to plug in various different, I call it invocation models. So if you go back to the whole, like Java, write once, write anywhere, or write once, run anywhere. I actually like a couple of talks that I did a couple of years ago were like write once, execute anywhere, because that's really,
I love it, and that means that if today I want to use RabbitMQ, I can, and then tomorrow if I decide to use Azure Functions, I can. It's the same code, same function, right?
And what's interesting is, like, for example, if you, obviously you're familiar, Julian and some of the AWS guys. So of course Microsoft and AWS, they created their own interfaces like request stream handler on AWS, and and in Microsoft you basically just the proliferation of all these annotations, right? So sorry, I'm still battling, like coming out of my little cold.
Oh dear, feel better.
So the problem was that they're very simple interfaces, no big deal, right, to implement them. But it also means you had to have it on the class path. You had to know about them. You have to know how to implement them. You have to do type conversion. You have to do all kinds of different things. So by implementing it just pure function, first of all, you don't even have to know that your function will become a Lambda at some point of time and will be running on Azure or AWS. In fact, you may never know. Somebody else will take your code and will deploy it as AWS Lambda. Will know that, but you won't. But the thing is that what you will end up enjoying is that type conversion, function composition, error handling, and tracing. I mean, you name it. So all these things are inside of Spring Cloud Function. So if you remember, a lot of it was in Spring Cloud Stream. So over the years, as we start plugging in Spring Cloud Function as a programming model, we start moving that down the stack. So Spring Cloud Stream today, if you ask me what it is, I say it's a binding framework. That's all it is.
Right. Yeah.
None of the heavy stuff is happening there.
Right.
It's a glorified wrappers over inbound, outbound channel adapters from Spring integration. Thank you very much. Right?
Yeah.
And then all they do is just delegate the function, because then, it's not the right type. Let me convert it for you. Oh, there's error happen. Let me fix it for you.
I love that you can. We're building on layers of solid stuff here, right? And we get up the abstraction stack. But at the end of the day, what that means, because Spring is a dependency injection framework, and because it's just about helping you have clean, well understood seams in the abstraction, because that's just dependency injection, you can still work at lower levels if you need to, but as you want to move up higher, you get more and more benefits, and you can throw away more and more code, right?
I mean, it's like we say, I'm wearing a developer hat. Yes, of course, we often wear multiple hats, right? But it allows me, this type of architecture allows me to say, okay, for the next 3 hours, I'm going to be just a hardcore Java developer. I don't care about anything else, right? Then I'm going to swap the head. I'm going to say, now I'm going to become an ops guy, and I'm going to wrap it into Lambda this thing and whatever and deploy it there, right? So we often do that, especially in the open source. But when it comes to enterprise teams, like I think about value proposition, if you are the CIO of some insurance company, because I always say, you know what, I work for an engineering company, I work for a computer company, which means I'm actually just like yourself and many other we're actually assets.
Yeah.
When it comes to like, this is like a very sort of sensitive thing to say, but if you work for an insurance company or a bank or whatever, you're kind of like a liability because they're not in the business of producing software.
No,
but they need you, right? So, but they can save some money by saying, listen, I'm going to, possibly hire some junior developers because they don't need to know AWS, they don't need to know Azure, they don't need to know a lot of these other things, even Spring. They can just write a function.
Right, exactly.
And then,
they're immune to the infrastructure.
Sensitivity aside, I think it's the stronger point here is the clear separation of who you are, what you are right now, what you're gonna be in the next 2 hours, and so on and so forth, in this flow of things that you're doing as a developer.
Right. It's even possible. So, okay, wait. Somebody said, this is great too.
Immune to infrastructure, I like that.
Sorry, I love it.
I like the last phrase. Sorry. Immune to infrastructure.
Yeah. Right. It's even possible to deploy a standard application as a function simply by adding a handler entry point. That's true. Yeah, you can take a regular Spring Boot app and add a Spring Cloud function bean to it. You drag it along with the app.
That's kind of what I was talking earlier about REST endpoints as Lambda. That's
right.
That the general premise is what was in that one sentence. So.
Right. It's amazing. Like
so let's hire that guy.
And I've been. So I kind of think about this a lot because it's why do we do messaging, right? Why not just do everything in the same code base? And there's a few obvious reasons, right? And when I say messaging, again, that's just code for Josh's way of thinking about moving work out of the hot path to something.
I have a better option by messaging.
Why?
First of all, why not? Because if you think about it, I mean, you're what, 40 something? I'm 54, right? So we've been around for only a little bit of time in the entire humanity, right?
Right.
But I always say the concept of, I always like to draw an analogy to something that is real, that's existed for much, much longer than us.
Right.
And the concept of a mail, right? Delivery of a message, right? It existed since God knows how long, right? Even with the pigeons and other things. And what's interesting, if you think about what has always been there besides the message, it was wrapped in some kind of envelope, even if it was folded in itself. There was some metadata written on it saying it's addressed to Josh Long, but the payload was always secured.
Right, in an envelope.
So this concept existed for thousands of years.
Yeah.
And humanity had millions of chances to improve it. And they improved some parts of it, but the core of it, message, payload, and headers remains. So why do you want to go coarse grain? Why do you want to swim,
Well, sure. I guess what I was trying to say, I was differentiating that.
That's a natural way of communicating because I can convey everything that I need via message.
Right. Yeah. No, I'm with you.
That's the answer.
I was what I was trying to say was I differentiated from for example, like RPC, and I differentiated from like why bother teasing things apart at all when you could just put everything in one giant mega code base. And so the reason I use messaging or eventing or function, whatever, the reason I send work from my node to another node, there's a lot of reasons. First of all, better reuse. I can have single things isolated and I can add to it without changing my code. Second of all, scalability. I can scale that thing out as I need to, separate from the use case or from the scale of my application, my workload. Third, I get asynchronicity and buffering and all that stuff, so I can make sure that thing is able to respond to requests from multiple services at the same time, whether my service is up or down, right? There's lots of reasons to think about, like, why would I take code here? And especially if you're doing like a web app or whatever in Spring, you don't want to do long-running things in the middle of a web hot path. It's much better to think about it, okay, I'm going to send this work over there. It'll happen on another node. When it's done, I'll get a notification. I'll tell the user, but the web request thread pool isn't being starved in the meantime,
Remember this, that 10 years ago, 12 years ago, that new thing that we all talk about, like this distributed computing.
Yeah, and grids. Remember we had that big
so
grid?
it's not new anymore, right?
No.
So expecting that your code is going to, like, we're going back to the question by reference and everything else, expecting that your code is going to, like, so you look at the computing, not necessarily as a computer, like it's a computer grid, right? So you should always assume that it's just out there, like in the cloud, and sometimes it's going to execute local, sometimes it's going to get passed on. So, and if you don't have architecture that supports that paradigm,
Right.
sooner or later you're going to hit the wall. So message, it's kind of a safe bet. At some point, if unless you really know exactly, sure, if you're writing some kind of a, on a Raspberry Pi, some kind of limited memory, limited processing power, but you working on some really, like a sensory functionality that does very little thing, sure, write it in the most optimal way because you only going to live there. But if you writing an enterprise app, and the overkill of doing a message, which is, I don't even consider it an overkill, but if you do, then I say that's the price that I'm willing to pay.
Right, 100%. Now, okay, before we last question, we talked about how you get this nice portability by writing code in terms of Spring Cloud Function. Are you sacrificing specific features of the underlying technologies in this case as well? Like, for example, if I want to get access to particular headers from Kafka or from Lambda, are those still there, or is it just a generic thing that is completely ignorant of the?
In fact, this is how we determine where the message came from.
Right. Okay.
Like for example, for cloud events, that's another thing we support, right? So this is how I know, because I need to. Cloud events somehow decided that the headers for different protocols should have different prefixes. Beats the hell out of me, but it is what it is. But that's how I decide whether the message came from Rabbit or Kafka, because I need to append different prefix for cloud event attributes.
Right.
So that goes back to the question. So yes, even that deep down in the developer code, if I receive a message and say, oh, that came from Kafka, or that came from REST because I see HTTP headers, or that came from, I have everything.
Yeah, exactly. Okay,
so I'm not sacrificing anything. In fact, I'm gaining, because now you don't have to think, oh shit, like, you remember the databases, schema first, and I'm like, oh, I wish I thought about this and added another column, because now I cannot. It's like a big deal, right? Well, and then the Hadoop thing, like, I'll just dump everything, we'll sort it out later, right? So it's like the other extreme, right? But the message says, listen, I have object and map, and you can load that map as much as you want.
Yeah.
You never have to change the structure of the object itself.
Right. And what I was kind of getting at was also, if you want to configure things like the connection factories and all that, it's just Spring. Just override those bean definitions just like you would for anything, and you can tweak parts of their engine. You don't have to rebuild everything just to be able to change how messages, priorities and thread pools.
Most of the stuff, like with Spring Cloud Stream, when it comes to brokers and connection, you just configure them through properties. I mean, it's to get something so complex that you have to override a connection factor or a session factor or something like that. I can't recall. I probably need to call Gary for that.
It's rare. I agree. That's what I'm trying to say.
Because he basically doesn't forget anything, so he would remember.
So we're talking about Gary Russell. So we've talked about some. So everybody we've talked about today has been on the show, by the way. Like Kristen Solov, Gary Russell, Artem. So if you're listening to the show on the podcast, just go to the back issues or back episodes or whatever. I don't know, the log.
I have to pull out Artem really quick, if I may. This is like the Cinderella story of open source and Spring. So when I was back in 2011-ish, 10-ish, we started we had Spring forums. We didn't have Stack Overflow back then. So this kid is contributing with questions, and he is in the Kyiv, Ukraine. So basically, Mark and I wake up in the morning, all the questions already answered. We're like, oh shit, we can't really do anything, right? So, and then a bunch of pull requests and everything else. I'm like, this guy is an animal. So
a good one.
So again, fast forwarding. So I reached out to him. I said, listen, you're doing an amazing job, and so on. And Artem at the time assumed that I'm offering him a job. And I said, listen, hopefully at some point of time it'll come to this. But at this point of time, we just wanted to acknowledge your presence and everything else and so on and so forth. So fast forwarding a couple of years, I'm leaving Spring, and Mark is basically asking me like, who do you think should replace you? Like, and I say, listen, if you can, you got to find a way to. Oh no, before that, you, me, and a few other guys, we're doing this spring one tour. If you remember, Kyiv, Moscow, London,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And we met Artem. He was actually part of the keynote. We brought him in on stage and said, listen, this is the guy who contributes, blah, blah, blah. And he's a committer. At that point in time, he was already a committer. So I said, any one of you can become this, right? So, and then again, a few years later, I'm leaving, and that's what I just said. So I said, find a way to hire this guy. And then I left, and then I maintained contact with Artem, and I found that he was hired somehow. They managed to do that. So he eventually got hired, and then while I was still in other company, he got his dream come true. He got a transfer. And I remember I actually working for another company. I wasn't part of the Spring organization at the time, but I picked him up and his wife at JFK. They just landed with a cat, 2 people, and a kid. And I picked him up. I rented the hotel for them and everything. So like and look where he's now. He's got a house. He's got a normal life, and and a great developer, great engineer, well respected within the team, all around amazing guy.
Well, amazing, and he's also one of those people that he works as hard as he's ever worked, and it blows my mind because
he's an animal.
He's a beast mode, totally, 100%. Like he writes documents. He's a lead now of Spring Innovation, right? He's a Spring Innovation lead, not just a committer, not just a contributor, but
so the guy went from contributing to the forums, kind of pissing Mark and I off because we couldn't really answer any questions, to the lead of the project that he remained loyal throughout all these years, and not just like an amazing lead. I mean, I can't imagine anybody better at that.
So here's another thing. Here's another parallel. You worked on a project called Spring Scala, which created and didn't you do the Groovy DSL for Spring Innovation?
No, that wasn't me. Thank God.
Okay. What was the DSL? There was a DSL.
I did Scala DSL, and I had a lot of fun with it.
Yes.
Because for DSL, Scala was
pretty good.
Very good.
Because
of the interaction with the compiler, the things you could do. Like, for example, remember service activator. Like I was always saying, if DSL, like the Fluent API only makes sense if when I say dot and the IntelliSense tells me, look, what can I do? If you can only suggest what I can actually do. Right. So if I do that service and the service doesn't return in my Lambda, doesn't return anything. Because remember, service activator could return a value or could be a consumer. So I had this problem. And Scala guys, that's easy. And they just send me the piece of code that I included. I'm like, if it looks inside of your Lambda and it determines at the compile time, you're not returning anything. You're returning units. So there's nothing to continue. So when you say dot, it says the only thing you can do is build.
Right.
And if you return foo, all of a sudden you can do slew of things. So it was great. It was fun.
So that was 2011, right? That stuff. And I remember that stuff. And I was so excited because that was the first time Spring Innovation had sprouted non-XML wings, right?
Well, there was Ru, if you remember that.
But it wasn't. There was no DSL except for other languages, right? In Java, we didn't have it.
Right.
Artem, I give Artem credit for this, right? He's the one who created the integration flow DSL.
Oh yeah, the Java DSL.
And the Java DSL, the one that everybody's using today, and that like the Scala one was the first one, and I think it was great. But
Groovy DSL, Turansky, double with that. That Dave Turansky, if you remember Dave Turansky, he did the Groovy DSL.
That's right.
Yes. I just remembered,
Right, there's a Groovy DSL, there's a Scala DSL. I remember those early days we had like DSLs, but for the Java people, for the JV people writing Java code, it's still XML for you, because we couldn't get it right. And then Artem came in and delivered this masterpiece of a code base. Like the DSL, do not try and understand it, my friend. I don't even understand. I've been using it for a decade now, almost, and only Artem can write that code and make it work. But when you're using it, when you're consuming it as a consumer, not writing to it, it's the easiest thing in the world. It just works, and it's beautiful, and it's clean, and that's Artem. Amazing. My friends, you're one of my heroes. I think that's obvious. But I want other people to know about you. I know how to reach you because you have foolishly given me your phone number. But where can other people who want to find you on the internet, where can they find you? Are you on the internet? Do you want to be found? And if so, where?
So Z_Oleg at Twitter.
That's the easiest.
Oleg Z at GitHub.
That's probably a lot.
I'm on LinkedIn, but I don't use it. I mean, I check it maybe 3 times a year. So yeah,
Twitter
probably it's really need to like ping me and get my attention. I'm not a frequent Twitterer, but at least my phone will blink. And then maybe if something's interesting, maybe I'll give you my email.
Right. And then somebody just posted a great thing here. My son is studying computer science at a local college. He said he's learning stuff that's already. Why isn't there a book or Spring book or a class in college? I want to point you to spring.academy. Spring.academy is amazing.
But I also have a slightly different answer to the question. When your son does graduate the college, he will have a diploma on the technology that's already obsolete.
Right.
So, in other words, well, it's not just the beginning; it's at the very end. I mean, when you get the diploma and say, "I'm a computer scientist," well, you just got certified in technology that's already a legacy, right? So, the thing is that the only advice, like, when I talk to students and younger developers, say, listen, if you can't self-learn, if you cannot open Google, read reference manual, get a book, and learn from that by yourself, maybe and do it at 2:00 in the morning and get some instant sense of gratification when you're like, yes, I solved the problem, I understand now, whatever, and run. It's not the job for you, because yes, it's exciting, but sometimes we could go throughout the day and don't produce anything because it wasn't that type of day. But sometimes 16, 18 hours sounds like a normal working day.
It is.
You can't accept that. If you can't say that's normal, that's fine, that's whatever. And because I needed to learn something before I write any piece of code, and then I need to write thousands of lines of code that I'm going to throw away, deliberately knowing that. If you can't accept that, then...
Yeah. But I will say, if you're doing it right, if you get to the point where... So at some point, you work these crazy long days. I'm not saying it's always going to be fun, but a lot of times, those crazy long days are the ones that feel most satisfying because you took something that wasn't there and made it there.
Look at right now. It's 8:00 here in south of France.
Oh yeah.
Believe me, I could find 10 other better things to do than talk to you.
I know, and I cannot think of a better thing I would like to do. But I appreciate you taking the time, my friend. It's been great. People are they say they have enjoyed our conversation. That's of course because of you and your wisdom. I appreciate you taking the time. For those of you on the show, join us again in like 15 minutes. I'll have Mahmoud Ben Hassin, who's the lead of Spring Batch. So we're going to sign off, and we'll see you all in 16-17 minutes. Thank you,
Josh. It was always a pleasure. I'll see you in a few months. Well, in a month in Atlanta.
Yes, sir. Can't wait. DevNexus. That's going to be great.
DevNexus, yes. All right, dude. Cheers.
Bye, everybody.